Good afternoon. This is Zuby Wilson here on Living on the Edge on KSFR 101.1 FM, broadcasting live on the web at ksfr.org. And today we're going to talk a little bit about some changes that have been proposed for the waste isolation pilot plant. That's WIP is what most people refer to it as. And we'll get into a little bit about what that is all about. When I first moved to Santa Fe, it was impossible not to know what WIP was all about. That was before it was actually commissioned. It's a place that disposes of low-level radioactive waste down near Carlsbad and some salt canyons or some salt structures down there. But I'm going to let the experts tell us more about that in general. I've got with me on the phone today Cindy Wheeler from the 285 All Coalition and Don Hancock from the Southwest Research and Information Center. Welcome both of you to Living on the Edge.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. So I'm going to start with Cindy for two reasons. One, because Cindy was the one that called me up and asked if we might be able to do a show. And because I think, where Don has a great deal of expertise in this area, I think we have to always remember how important our community activists are. And knowing not just all of the details and the technical information, but knowing why you should care and what you can do about it. So Cindy, why don't you tell me a little bit how you got involved and tell me what is the 285 All?
Oh, hi. 285 All is a group, nonprofit, nonpartisan group of people in the communities that live along Highway 285. There's probably about 9,000 residents total, not all in El Dorado, but certainly a lot of them, which is where I live. And that's the route, 285, along with Highway 599 north of Santa Fe, that handles the waste that has been going to WIP all of this time, since the 1990s, and will continue to handle the waste if WIP expands. And we don't think that it's equipped to handle it.
Mm-hmm. And how did you first get involved in this?
Probably, I'm trying to think, probably through knowing Dawn and Joni at some of the nonprofits. Joni works is the executive director of Concerned Citizens for Nuclear Safety, and Dawn for Southwest Southwest Resource and Information Center. But I've always been interested in this. I mean, I grew up in Roswell. My dad was stationed at a Strategic Air Command base there, and so nuclear issues have been important to me. If I can just kind of start off by saying what, to me, there's a couple of things that are very concerning about this issue, and even before we describe it, I think the most insidious thing about this WIP expansion is that no one knows it's happening. My state elected officials didn't know when I met with them last week. My neighbors don't know, and yet we're being forced to take the risks for the Department of Energy as it implements a program that nobody knows about. And the second most insidious thing is that this expansion, the public, the people who are taking all of the risk, has no opportunity to submit comments to those that are making the decisions. So they couldn't comment because they didn't know about it. And also, there was a very short comment time period, which is over. We can't even communicate with the Secretary of the New Mexico Environment Department about this topic right now because he's in decision-making mode. And so we feel like we're kind of up against a brick wall here. Mm-hmm.
Well, Don, I want to turn to you for a second and just kind of, for those of people who aren't aware, so WIP is the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant. I know when I first moved to New Mexico, it was a very big deal. It didn't exist yet. It was proposed, and there were massive people's movements to try to stop that. There was a very active Businesses Against WIP organization that could bring out enormous numbers of people for testimony and for events. And at one point, I thought it had actually been defeated, and then it reappeared and it became a real thing. In many ways, I feel as though the reason we have WIP is they were very persistent, and there was organizing fatigue that happened after a while. People just got tired of testifying twice a year about why it shouldn't be here. But Don, why don't you tell us what is WIP? What is the idea? What is the term pilot in that, and what's the significance of that? And what was its original mission, and what is going on to change that?
Well, importantly, for more than 40 years, as you just said, pilot plant means first of several, first of multiple what are called deep geologic repositories, where the waste is in place that this is nuclear waste, plutonium-contaminated waste from producing nuclear weapons. So it's not nuclear weapons themselves. It's waste from producing the weapons. That's radioactive, plutonium being a principal contaminant. Because plutonium is dangerous for literally hundreds of thousands of years, the idea is that it, similar to hotter, more radioactive high-level waste, because it's long-lived, it needs to be put deep underground, away from people, away from the environment. So WIP was designed in the 1970s to be the first, as the law said in 1979, to demonstrate the safe disposal, not to be the one and only. One of the reasons there was all the protesting that you talked about is there was a lot of concern that it would end up being the one and only. And while they kept saying it's going to be limited in terms of time, in terms of types of waste, in terms of amounts of waste, in terms of radioactivity, there was always the concern that, it would expand. And that's been proven out because today, the only deep geologic repository in the United States is WIP. So while the law says agreements with the state say promises to people of New Mexico all had these limits on it, there is no other repository. So my view is unless citizens of New Mexico and New Mexico officials really say, well, you made promises, the law is the law, we're drawing lines, you can't go past that kind of thing, there will be continuing pressure from other parts of the country to send waste to WIP, and with the idea that it's the only place. So it's in addition to the specific expansion proposals that we can talk about, this overall understanding that until the state of New Mexico and our elected congressional officials push hard and say, no, we're not going to allow any of these expansions. It'll be a piecemeal kind of expansion. Oh, a little bit more waste won't really hurt. And then a little bit more after that, and a little bit more after that, and expanding the facility a little bit so it can handle a little more waste. That'll be okay. We won't do more, and then, of course, they'll want to do more, et cetera. So that's the big picture that people need to be aware of. And most recently, the Department of Energy has actually formally said all of those things. They've said, rather than closing WIP in 2024 after 25 years of operations, they want to literally get rid of an ending date so that WIP could continue to operate forever.
Mm-hmm. No, so what happened with that? Were there other sites identified around the country that might have been the other deep formation storage sites?
Yes.
I mean, the one that comes to mind is at one point where there was a discussion of Yucca Mountain being for high level. Right. Were there any others, and why were none of these others developed?
Okay, so briefly, and I can go on this very long, but briefly, so WIP was first authorized by Congress in 1979. 3 years later, 1982, Congress passed what was called the Nuclear Waste Policy Act that said, yes, there need to be multiple geologic repositories in multiple media, In other words, as you mentioned, WIP is in salt, but using different geologic media, because, of course, while one can think maybe salt is good, or granite is good, or shale is good, or volcanic rock is good, et cetera, you don't really know for sure. So that law was passed. The Department of Energy started implementing it, and implementing it very poorly. They kind of picked sites that they wanted to, not being technically adequate. So, yes, in 1983, the Department of Energy said, hey, we're looking at 9 different sites for a repository, and then by 1986 they said, and we're looking at 20 other sites in other parts of the country. But making very long, complicated story short, DOE, as I said, didn't have the technical basis for it. There were huge opposition around the country to sites that were being proposed. So rather than doing multiple sites, by 1987, Congress decided, well, this is all too complicated and there's too much controversy, and we got people all over the country saying this is all terrible and dangerous and whatever. So we need to pick some place to do it, and we'll pick Yucca Mountain in Nevada, because at the time Nevada was even more politically weak than New Mexico was. Few people, et cetera, et cetera. Well, state of Nevada, since 1987, has taken numerous actions to demonstrate that Yucca Mountain is not technically feasible. Western Shoshone and other tribes out there have said, this is our tribal land, you can't use it. So there are technical problems, there are legal problems, there are huge political problems. Huge majorities of people in Nevada continue to object to Yucca Mountain. So WIP was supposed to be the first one, and then Yucca Mountain was supposed to be the second one, and then there were supposed to be others. But because of how the combination of the Department of Energy and, frankly, people in Congress who tried to make political decisions to short circuit, we've been left with WIP and Yucca Mountain is just not going to happen. And so the idea is, and back to my earlier point, Congress, President, New Mexico need to say, okay, enough is enough. We got to get back on track. Yes, it's going to take some new laws, but we're going to have to go back and start really developing technically sound, publicly accepted sites for this waste. And in the meantime, we're going to need to develop better ways of storing it safely where it is. And by the way, when we don't have disposal sites for it, we need to think very seriously, and we would argue more than think about. We need to decide we can't really keep making this waste for both nuclear weapons and nuclear power plants when we don't have any place to deal with various very long-term dangerous wastes.
Mm-hmm. Now, I remember from a long time ago, before I even moved to New Mexico, that I had heard that New Mexico was already been decided would be a nuclear sacrifice zone. We already had 2 of the nuclear weapons labs. We had already blown up. We'd already have some radiation because we'd actually blown up some nuclear weapons here, and we were mining a lot of the uranium right here in New Mexico. So, so is there any point to that? Is that a legitimate thing that New Mexico maybe just needs someplace has to be the sacrifice zone, and we're it?
What you said, all of that you said is true. One key element of all of this, which is where places for Yucca Mountain and other things are for, we have no commercial nuclear power plants in New Mexico. We never have. So the most radioactive waste that comes from commercial nuclear power plants, we have none of that here. And that's why one of the limits that was put and one of the promises made and legal agreements made is no commercial waste could come to WIP because, we were heavily involved. We are. We will continue to be heavily involved in the nuclear weapons side, but we haven't been involved in the commercial nuclear power side. So, Yucca Mountain and these other things I talked about with the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, other sites, were primarily supposed to be for commercial waste. But now we have this situation where there is no place for the commercial waste. And so more than 90% of the commercial waste, the most radioactive high-level waste from commercial nuclear power plants, 92% of that waste is east of the 100th meridian, essentially in the eastern half of the country. So there's no reason that New Mexico or Nevada or other places in the West should be national sacrifice areas for waste that we didn't create, we didn't get the jobs from, we didn't get the electricity from, et cetera. So that's part of what needs to be looked at. And while we're not talking about it today specifically, just a number of your listeners will know that there is a active proposal to bring all of that spent fuel to New Mexico, not initially at WIPP, but at a site about 12 miles from WIPP that's being proposed by Holtec to also bring this commercial waste to New Mexico. And lots of people in the state of New Mexico have objected to that and will continue to do so.
So that's an important distinction, I think, because I know a lot of people who've been active and been hearing about this Holtec plant, which is, like you just described very well. That is entirely different than this recommissioning or changing the mission of WIPP going on right now.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
No, we're kind of like it looks to me from the history that we're kind of at the end of a process. The redesignation of WIPP has a lot to do with some of the treaties that Clinton was working on to reduce nuclear weapons between Russia and the United States. And this has been on kind of like, well, what are we going to do with all of this stuff? And there's been processes developed over time of how we're going to, not where, but how we're going to dispose of them. And there were two options, the MOX option versus the dilute and dispose option. And I'm not technically familiar enough to talk about that, and it may be too much to do on a radio show. But we have decided, I guess, Mr. Perry had found out that the dilute and dispose would only cost about $20 billion, whereas the MOX option was going to be about $50 billion. Can you tell us anything about MOX versus dilute and dispose?
Sure.
And whether, is one of them better and one of them cheaper, and we just have chosen the cheap one, or are they both equally bad? Or
so the idea is we all know we have lots of nuclear weapons, and there is lots of weapons-grade plutonium that goes into these nuclear weapons, but we have more plutonium and more weapons than we need. So, as you said, particularly in the 80s and 90s, we entered into arms control agreements with Russia, and one of those said both Russia and the U.S. were going to declare significant amount of their weapons-grade plutonium surplus, and we're going to get rid of it. And how do you get rid of weapons-grade plutonium? You don't want to blow it up in bombs, so what do you do with it? Well, many of us, including my organization and many others, said treat it as waste, solidify it, and store it where it is until there are geologic repositories to put it in, not WIPP. Other people said, well, let's use it. Let's put it into nuclear power plants. This is this mixed oxide uranium-plutonium fuel, which we haven't used in the United States for fuel from our power plants, but there are a few places, other nations that have used some MOX fuel. But the idea is to put mixed plutonium and uranium into fuel rods that are put in reactors, and you then create more of this high-level waste that we talked about. But the weapons-grade plutonium would be in a very hot radioactive situation, so it would be very difficult to then get it out to use it in weapons. In late 90s, the Clinton administration said, let's try both. Let's work forward on MOX, let's work forward on the what's called immobilization to solidify it kind of thing. The Bush administration, George W. Bush administration, decided to drop the second alternative of waste and only do MOX. They argued at the time it would not only be better, but that it would be cheaper. Of course, a lot of us said from the beginning that wasn't going to be true. But anyway, the politics of that was that MOX plant was going to be built and was started to be built and was going to be in South Carolina. It was going to be a multi-billion-dollar that was going to create lots of jobs. So, create some political support for the idea in South Carolina. Over time, it became clear that it wasn't going to work technically, and it was going to be very, very expensive, like you said, tens of billions of dollars. So finally, it was determined to, after a lot of billions of dollars has been spent, about $7 billion has been spent, it was finally decided to stop the MOX plant. Well, then the question is, what do you do instead? They could go back to this whole immobilization idea, but instead they said, we have WIP. So the dilute part of it is to put classified chemicals into the plutonium to make it harder to be used for weapons grade, to dilute it at Savannah River site using sort of a reconfigured version of the MOX plant to keep some of the political support and money in South Carolina. And then, since, again, back to our original point, where is the only place to put this stuff? WIP. Well, we'll dilute and dispose of it in South Carolina and ship it to WIP. So that's an idea. The National Academy of Sciences earlier this year finished a report that they'd been working on for about 3 years that said maybe you can do this, although there are some technical unknowns. But by the way, all of this waste would violate the legal agreements with New Mexico, and there hasn't been any discussion with the state of New Mexico about it. So, among other things, there should be a public process to talk to the people of New Mexico about whether this is a good idea or not. We will notice, as Cindy said at the start of the show, none of that public conversation has yet happened with the people of New Mexico. So, in theory, the final decision hasn't been made, but in fact, the MOX plant construction has been shut down, so, it's dead, and it should be dead, and there are other options, but at this point, the Department of Energy is only pursuing this dilute and dispose and ship it to WIP.
Okay. I want to bring Cindy back in just a minute, but we have to take a quick break first. This is Zuby Wilson here on Living on the Edge on KSFR 101.1 FM, broadcasting live on the web at KSFR.org. I have with me today Cindy Wheeler from 285 All and Don Hancock from the Southwest Research and Information Center. We're talking about some proposed revisions to the waste isolation pilot plant to begin bringing in, not only to bring in different characters of waste, but also when the pilot plant was originally developed, it was supposed to be only until 2024. So theoretically, 4 years from now, we would no longer be bringing shipments in from anywhere into WIP. But the proposal is to extend that, and I believe indefinitely. So we'll be back right after these messages to talk more about this very important subject.
Hello, this is Stu Goswick, host of CinemaScope. Now in our 10th year, CinemaScope continues to promote our wonderful New Mexico film industry with current news and interesting interviews every Friday at 4:30. Listen to CinemaScope during your drive time, and don't forget to check out our podcasts at KSFR.org. CinemaScope, all about the film, TV, and new media business here in New Mexico. Every Friday at 4:30 here on KSFR.
He's been thinking about the presidency for decade after decade, and so much of it won't look like he expected it to in this moment of triumph. And in some ways, it's a fitting coda to have him accepting the nomination in a way so radically different from what he had hoped.
I'm Michael Barbaro. That's Today on the Daily from the New York Times. today at 5 p.m. on KSFR.
And we're back. This is Zuby Wilson here on Living on the Edge on KSFR 101.1 FM, broadcasting live from the Santa Fe Community College. And today we are talking about some proposals to expand the mission of the waste isolation pilot plant for disposal of nuclear material. And I have with me on the show Don Hancock from Southwest Research and Information Center and Cindy Wheeler from 285 On. I want to bring you back into the conversation at this point, Cindy, and talk a little bit about the public process. You're saying that that there hasn't been much of a public process. Could you tell us, has there been anything and just no one knew about it, or what's been going on in terms of public input on this potentially very significant decision being made in New Mexico?
Well, like I said, it's hard to do anything or make a public comment about something that no one knows is happening. And that's where we're at right now. There was I believe, a 2-month public comment period that I heard about a week before it ended. And during that week, I spoke to my state representative and state senator about it, and they didn't know about it. And so if they didn't know about it, how would the rest of us know? And that comment period has now ended, so we don't know what's going to happen. But the Department of Energy wants to now bring all of the nation's nuclear weapons waste to WIPP. And so that will exponentially increase the amount of nuclear waste traveling on our roads and for an exponentially longer period of time. And so you can imagine the concerns that people would want to give to the agencies, someone in our position. First of all, we know accidents happen. And so you've just increased the amount that you're moving along these neighborhoods. The Los Alamos Study Group figured that it will increase the mass of plutonium being shipped along 285 by 100 times what it is now. We know that space shuttles explode, the tsunami at Fukushima, even at WIPP, a canister exploded and shut it down for 3 years. And according to the route that they're thinking of using, it will take that waste, those shipments, past us on 285 north of I-40 and Highway 599 to Lannel, and then back again. So it will pass us twice, the same shipment, as they kind of pass it off from one laboratory to another to have different things done to it. Let's see, plutonium will be put into a powdered form as it's turned into plutonium oxide at Lannel, and that in an accident can be aerosolized and inhaled, and a millionth of an ounce will eventually cause cancer to someone who has inhaled it. So a medical doctor who lives along the route with me and the rest of us on 285 has described this as a public health emergency. And I'm wondering, are we really ready for a public health emergency?
That's a very good point. So I'm a little confused. They can't just do all the processing at Savannah River in South Carolina. It has to be, part of it has to be done at Lannel as well, and either one of you could jump in on that.
So what Cindy's describing yet another thing. So this is different than the dilute and dispose that we talked about. This is the idea of actually building new plutonium pits, the cores of nuclear weapons, at Los Alamos. About 97-98% of all the plutonium pits or cores in the existing U.S. Weapons stockpile were manufactured at the Rocky Flats plant near Boulder, Colorado, north of Denver, essentially in the 60s, 70s, starting in the 50s, but mostly 60s, 70s, and 80s. All of these pits were created. Rocky Flats was shut down. A lot of the waste not the pits, but a lot of the waste from that contamination is what became waste that came to WIPP. And we haven't been creating very many plutonium pits for a long time because we have lots of nuclear weapons. Our nuclear weapons would continue to work if we needed them to, et cetera. But now there are proposals that Cindy just described to create more plutonium pits, and to do that, some of that at Los Alamos and some of that at Savannah River. And so there is some plutonium at Los Alamos, but a lot more plutonium would have to come to Los Alamos for this oxide process that Cindy talked about. So you'd have to bring plutonium in from probably mostly from the Pantex plant, where the weapons are actually put together. The nuclear bombs are actually put together near Amarillo, Texas, at the Pantex plant. But plutonium would come from Pantex to Los Alamos to do this oxidation that Cindy described. And then, as she said, that would then be, in some cases, pits would be created at Los Alamos, and in some cases, pits would be created at the Savannah River site. So, again, do we need to replace all the existing pits in our existing nuclear bombs? Many of us would say no, but that is a proposal. So, two points about that. This would increase what's going on at Los Alamos. As Cindy said, it was increase shipments going to and from. And remember what I said about Rocky Flats, this pit production process creates a lot of waste at Los Alamos and at Savannah River, waste that doesn't currently exist. In other words, this is new weapons and new waste, so that the new waste would also, of course, then end up going to WIPP in the DOE plan.
And for those of you who are regular listeners, you know pits are the triggers. They are the igniters, the thing that actually sets off. So it's a small nuclear weapon that sets off the bigger nuclear weapon. And Jay Coughlin's been on quite a number of times in the last couple of years talking about this. And I know right now the community college here is supporting a big big machinist program to develop the possibilities to expand pit production. And we're not going to go too deep into this right now, but one of the concerns that's been brought up is the new pits, because of various arms control agreements, can't be tested. So we don't really know. We have old pits that work fine and have a very, very, very long shelf life, but the new pits would be kind of a new journey, and in order to test them would really open up the whole gamut of other countries being able to do testing and potentially setting off an entire new nuclear arms race. But we're not going to go down that today. We're talking mostly about the disposal and the new mission for WIPP. But Cindy, you said 100 times as much traffic. Is that? I mean, I remember that was one of the big selling points. Only low-level nuclear waste like lab coats and things like that, and there would only be very few trucks going down, very infrequent. So how frequent are we talking about? Are we talking about multiple trips per day?
I haven't been able to get an exact number yet. I know that right now, or at least I'm pretty sure, so Dawn, correct me if I'm wrong, right now when I ask the WIPP transportation people how many shipments they've had this year, it's somewhere around 500. And so, we're talking about an expansion of that's really exponential. And when you think of what's needed, so first of all, you need to have emergency response preparedness down pat all along that route. And that's the job of the state. Okay, the federal government does not provide that. And so they're forcing the risk on us, but we're the ones that are responsible for making sure that we have all of the emergency response preparers and preparedness that we need to have. In fact, I just found out that, the barrel that exploded in WIPP and then shut it down for 3 years, it could have exploded anywhere along the route. It was just dumb luck that it actually exploded in the storage facility instead of on the road. And then just in Vermont in June, a nuclear waste cask, it was empty, luckily, but it tipped over in a ditch by the road and turned over. It took them 2 days before they could open that road again. So imagine the exposure to the public, to the emergency responders. You know, this idea that you could handle this emergency quickly is kind of a fantasy. Mm-hmm. And finally, there's no form of liability for loss of life or health or property. That precedent was set when the Trinity bomb went off, and the U.S. government has never reimbursed people for their medical health, their medical bills, or the loss of property.
So the soldiers and the official observers got some compensation, but what they call the downwinders,
yes.
the people from the neighboring communities who had the fallout landing on them and had cancer clusters and things, they've not gotten a dime so far.
No, and just imagine an accident near your house. A collision or an overturn like in Vermont, quite likely a fire, releasing aerosolized plutonium. So it's raining on your land, but you can't see it. You and your kids in the school are inhaling the particles, but you can't feel it. Your land can't be remediated. And think of the children. Children can't play on it. You can't grow gardens on it. And children are the real issue here, because if I inhaled some plutonium, it might take many years before I get a tumor from it or before it hits my bones or my liver. But children have all their lives. It's almost a death sentence for a cancer that's caused by that inhalation. It may be years, but plutonium is not nice stuff. And even though they call it low-level radiation, it's radioactive and it's an extremely toxic heavy metal.
Mm-hmm. So the one of the other things that the government always talked about was, well, these are shipped in these TruPack containers, and so there is no way for it to get out of them, even if it rolled off the truck. And would an explosion like what happened in WIP, would it have caused there to be a breach in a TruPack container, or are they really safe?
Well, we really don't know what happened in the WIP underground. As Cindy said, certainly the chemical reaction, as DOE likes to call it, rather than explosion, sent some waste literally through thousands of feet of underground tunnels, up the exhaust shaft, more than 2,000 feet up to the surface, and then out into the environment. So it was an intense explosion. The TruPack was never tested for that kind of explosion, so we don't actually know how it would perform. Up to now, the more than 12,700 shipments to WIP, as far as we know, there have not been any releases from the TruPack. So the combination of the drivers and the avoiding serious accidents and fires like Cindy talked about, that track record so far has been good. But again, we were going to have 4 or 5 more years of shipments, but instead we are, as Cindy said, if these various proposals, the dilute and dispose and the pit production, both go through, there would be many thousands more shipments. And one of the things that tends to happen, and one of the things I've felt all strongly about the 2014 WIP release, is people start getting complacent. Well, we haven't had a serious problem, so we won't have a serious problem. I have great concerns that over time that is much more likely to happen in terms of transportation. The other thing about TRUPACs, as I mentioned, there have been more than 12,700 shipments. Some of these TRUPACs are getting pretty old, and so most containers over time start deteriorating a little bit more. So that's another part of the concern as to so far the TRUPACs have performed well, but the longer they're used and the more complacent people get about, we know what we're doing, if we've done this 12,000 times, why nothing bad is ever going to happen, my concern is that will lead to the kind of carelessness that can contribute to accidents as well.
Yeah, as my OSHA instructor likes to tell me, things that have never happened before happen all the time.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and I don't know, Don, I hope I'm explaining this correctly, but the barrel that exploded at WIP, there were also several other trucks that were loaded with barrels in the same way and incorrectly packaged. And when WIP had the explosion, it closed down, so they rerouted those trucks to the waste control specialist, which is just across the border in Texas. And that waste is now stranded there because it's too dangerous to actually move those trucks just a few miles from there to WIP. And the reason that improper packaging occurred was because a consultant or contractor at Lannel wanted to earn a bonus and keep on schedule. And so that's another twist to the fact that accidents happen. And, people are people. They're going to do things that are unsafe sometimes. And the more you expose people to this dangerous stuff, just even if it's safe most of the time when it's going by, it's not going to be all the time.
And that was it was our best and the brightest up on the hill that never make mistakes used the wrong brand of cat litter. Is that
right.
to pack?
That was the conclusion of the DOE team that studied the accident. Yes.
Goodness gracious. So I want to go back for a minute, Cindy, and about the process. So the process for comment was a New Mexico process or a federal process?
A New Mexico process. It was comments to the New Mexico Environment Department.
But not even the Peter Wirth, who's one of the most powerful people in the legislature, was aware of this?
That's as I understand it, yes. When I spoke to my legislators, they didn't know about it. My county commissioner didn't know about it. It's just, that's what's insidious. This should be on the front pages, and it's not.
So, Zuby, part of what's going on, this particular comment period that Cindy was talking about was for a new fifth shaft. There have always been 4 shafts from the surface to the underground disposal area. DOE wants to build a new shaft. In fact, they're already constructing it, even though they don't have a permit to do it. And so the 60-day comment period that Cindy was just talking about was on a permit to allow this new shaft to be constructed. The Department of Energy says, we're just having the new shaft. Well, but there is no reason for the new shaft. The 4 shafts and the underground design of WIP was designed to handle all the legal limit that was all the waste that was legally allowed into WIP. You're doing a new shaft, and then you're going to do new underground disposal rooms. So all of this is about physically expanding the facility so it can handle more waste and operate longer. So again, the design was for the facility to operate around 25 years or so. All the waste, the 6.2 million cubic feet of waste that was supposed to go in, up to that level would go in. Then it could be closed up. But now the idea is we have all of these various proposals, and we haven't even talked about some of DOE's proposals to bring other waste to WIP. So you need to physically expand the facility. The argument is that the new shaft by itself doesn't allow them to expand the facility. The problem with that is that the only reason for this shaft is to expand the facility, and it's inevitable the DOE will ask for this shaft to then have additional disposal rooms to expand the facility to keep it going. And that's why, as Cindy says, it's the few people who know about it and how it's been advertised, oh, we're just building a new shaft, it's going to make WIP safer, it's going to improve the ventilation. That's not true. As I say, it's to expand the facility, so they're trying to hide the ball from people, so to speak, hide the expansion from folks. But then also, and this is another thing that's insidious, and so my organization has actually sued the Environment Department and before the Supreme Court, they allowed the shaft construction to begin even before the comment period, even before the required public hearing, even before the permit can be issued, which makes it a fait accompli.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to have to take another quick break. This is Zuby Wilson here on Living on the Edge on KSFR 101.1 FM, broadcasting live on the web at ksfr.org. I have with me over the telephone, very safely socially distancing, Cindy Wheeler from 285 All and Don Hancock from the Southwest Research and Information Center. We're talking about some proposals to expand the mission of WIP, and WIP is a waste isolation pilot plant down in Carlsbad. And it is the only place in the country where nuclear waste can be disposed of. It's supposed to be shutting down. The mission ends 2024, but now there's proposals to expand not only the time limit, but also the mission of what can go in there. And that's what we're talking about. We'll be right back after this brief message.
Universities are starting to put their summer planning to the test, but the future's anything but certain as the students return to campus.
What we do know is we're going to have to do more with less.
I'm Sarah McConnell. Join me for With Good Reason.
Today at 6:30 on KSFR.
And we're back. This is Zuby Wilson here on Living on the Edge on KSFR 101.1 FM, broadcasting live from the Santa Fe Community College. I have with me on the phone Don Hancock from Southwest Research and Information Center and Cindy Wheeler from 285 All. We're talking about the proposals to expand not only the time, like WIP, the waste isolation pilot plant is the only place where we are storing nuclear waste underground in the country, and it was supposed to end in 2024, part of the appeal when they were first getting the original permits for it. Unfortunately, nobody else in the country seems to want to have one of these spectacular repositories in their state, and so now we're at a point where they're talking about expanding it beyond 2024, not so much of a pilot any longer, and expanding the mission for what can be done down, what can be deposited there, and also the frequency of trips going up and down our roadways. So where are we at then? Is there some way to extend? Don, you guys are you're going to the Supreme Court trying to stop this. The beginning of the building the shaft, even when they don't have a permit to do that. That seems it would be easy to me, that the easy decision for the Supreme Court, but you never know. But is there anything else here? Is there a way to get our legislators involved, to get the governor involved, to expand and extend the comment period so people who are concerned can actually do something, or the county commissioners doing something? What is the best action people can take to try to put a break on this?
Can I jump in for just a second?
Cindy.
I want to make sure that I say my legislators are really on top of things, and it is not that they are just not paying attention. Mm-hmm. It's that kind of weird way that the DOE and now even the executive part of the state is kind of covering things up. And I wanted to make sure and say that. Mm-hmm. I think at the least, we should be communicating with our governor. At the least, everything should stop until the pandemic is over and the public has an opportunity to make its concerns known. Those who stand to suffer the most must have voices in this decision. And then I wanted to pass it to you, Don.
So, several things. We've talked about a number of kinds of expansion. Some decisions have been made, some are not. So, obviously, there are going to be multiple decisions that people need to participate in. In terms of the new shaft, there were more than 300 people who commented opposing this new shaft in the comment period that Cindy mentioned. There will be a public hearing about it, so there will be more opportunities for people to participate. The issue of how long WIP stays open is going to be a separate process by the Environment Department and DOE next year in 2021. So it'll be very important for lots of people to be saying it's not okay to change the 2024 date in the permit. It's not okay to keep WIP open forever. And yes, the Environment Department and other state officials need to both say no in that context, but also, as I started the discussion off, also be saying to folks in Congress and this president or the next president, whoever that is, that we need to get on. Congress is going to need to get on with looking at other repositories because New Mexico is not going to take it.
Mm-hmm. Cindy, do you have anything to add to that?
No, although, we need to know who's interested out there. Once people know what's going on, they have a choice, and that's their choice if they decide to oppose or not. But if they are interested in that, then we need to know who you are, and as we have events, then we can contact you. One way to do that, they could email me at nuclearwastewatchdog@gmail. And Don may have a better place.
Yeah, Concerned Citizens for Nuclear Safety, the nuclearactive.org website is also a good place to go and to send information. The Southwest Research and Information website is sric.org, and there's information there, and we would welcome people who are interested to email or call us as well.
Mm-hmm. So,
thank you, Zuby.
Absolutely. So the big thing now is, one, get your name on lists so as things develop, you know what's going on, what to do, what the actions being taken are. So get in and you can go to multiple organizations and be on their list. So thank you so much for coming on today, Cindy and Don. This is Zuby Wilson on Living on the Edge. Thank you so much for listening. The news is next.